Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Devil's Advocate podcast. This is Han Yang from Sydney, Australia. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Dominic Meagher from the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Dr. Meagher is a research area focused on industrial policy, and also you have been in China for many years. Tell us what brought you to China and what was your work involved at the
Sure,
time.
thanks, Hanyang. Yeah, as you said, I've been in China between between SARS and COVID. I was there at least once a year, maybe a bit more than a third of that time. So about 7 or 8 years all combined. Um, I went there the first time in 2003. Just to learn Chinese, and I spent the whole year there traveling around China, avoiding SARS and studying Chinese. And I went, I guess they say you catch the bug and you just get sucked into a place and you want to keep going back and learning more about it. And so that was me. I kept going back every year. My master's was related to Chinese economy. My PhD was on China's energy transition. Eventually, I think in 2012, I was there again when Xi Jinping took over. And in 2014-15, I was living in Hong Kong, working at a think tank there, and got to see the Umbrella Revolution up, front row. And I would say that had a pretty major effect on my view of China. Before that, I was probably quite gung ho on engagement as the way forward for Australia-China relations. Obviously, from then it became much more cautious, I would say. At the very least. And since then, since sort of 2014, the relations have been quite troubled, and I've been studying that as well. So it's those challenges have been weighing a lot on me over the last decade and a half or so. So that's sort of the short version of my engagement with China. I'm happy to go into more details on any of that if you're interested. But
Yeah, sure. I think we'll certainly talk about that during the conversation. Let's start first with the most recent breaking news last week about the Chinese missile test in South Pacific. You mentioned on Twitter that you think that many people who compare the Chinese test with the US test are getting it wrong. Can you elaborate on that? First, many supporters of Beijing in China and here in Australia point out that the United States did many of the similar tests every year. And Australia certainly didn't lodge any protest over that. And now the Australian government has expressed serious concern about the Chinese test. Is this a hypocrisy and double standard?
Look, there's a few differences here. One is the US testing regime is about maintaining the safety and security of their military. The purpose is not to create a big political signal. Right? They're not making a big fuss about it. They're not doing it in a way that's showy. Right? It's a very routine process. They have years of forewarning. When they do tests, the purpose is that some of their equipment is getting old, and they have to verify the maintenance. They want to make sure that things work when they're supposed to work and stay put when they're supposed to stay put. On top of that, their testing range is, they're firing into area that they have permission to fire into. Right? It's arranged with the local authorities. It's an ally of theirs. They do it. They pay for that use. All of this is very routine. It's not intended to intimidate anyone. It's purely there to verify that things work. Right? What happened, I think, last week was quite different. On one hand, and maybe this part of it is less different. Right? China was demonstrating second strike capability. So certainly the US has done that. Right? And I don't think we could say that China is out of their rights to demonstrate such a capability. The way they did it was a little bit weird in that they chose as their testing range countries that didn't invite them to use their territory or their near abroad as a testing range. They've shot their missiles over countries that didn't invite them or weren't consulted about it and weren't happy about it. They did it at a time specifically designed to maximize attention and to make sure that their message got heard, right? So if you think about this kind of test, there's a few things that you can be testing for. You could be testing for the engineering of the system, right? Making sure that the submarine goes where it's supposed to go, that the missile launches where it's supposed to launch. You could be testing for the command chain, right? To make sure that the crew of the boat understands when they're supposed to launch, what their target is, right? They shouldn't know that before they go underwater, because you have to test that they've received a signal, they've been able to verify that it's a legitimate signal, and they've been able to act on it in an appropriate time, right? So you're testing this kind of process. And then you're also testing, you're sending a message, you want to make sure that that's heard. And I think that last part is really what China was focused on, is the political signal. And this is why people are so upset, because that was the point. I mean, they're trying to upset people, they want people's attention, and they sure as have got it.
Yeah, but as you said, the United States conduct these tests, and so China is a growing nuclear power, military power, so it certainly is entitled, I guess, in a sense, that to make its own test. If it doesn't test here in the South Pacific, where can it test?
So normally they test in their own territory. They test on land. Previous tests, that's what they've done. They test. They have. China's not new to nuclear weapons, and this isn't the first time or the second time that they've made tests. They usually test in Western China desert, basically. Where it's their territory, they have permission to do it. They can control the area. They can make sure that people aren't wandering into the testing zone, right? In a dangerous area. For instance, last week when they fired these missiles, there were two areas in the East China Sea and the South China Sea that they signaled were danger zones. They didn't give the reason. They said it was something to do with satellites, I think. But they had to clear that area, and then they also had to clear the area, make sure there were no fishing boats in the target range. They didn't give very much notice to make sure that that was complied with, right? So the way they did it, they took a lot of risks with other people's lives and livelihoods. And the reason that they did it that way was, to send a signal. They could have done it in a safer and more routine way. That wasn't what they were aiming for.
All right. Okay. So let's move on to the topic of your area of studies, industrial policy and economics. So for decades, Australia has treated economics and national security as separate subjects, and your work suggests that those two words have merged now. So do you think geoeconomics have become Australia's new strategic reality?
For sure. And we saw that today, or recently, with Albanese's speech on artificial intelligence, where he talked a lot about sovereignty, right? You don't talk about sovereignty when you're talking about artificial intelligence investment, unless you think geoeconomics has a big part of the picture, right? In the case of artificial intelligence, one of the risks probably is brought home by Donald Trump recently with his, essentially his fight with Anthropic over, whether the U.S. Defense Department can use Anthropic in particular ways for mass surveillance or attacking targets with no human intervention, right? With no human verification that the target's legitimate. But Anthropic says we don't want our tools used this way, and they've created a huge fight over it. From Australia's perspective, you look at that and you see Donald Trump doing things like saying, you're not allowed to give the latest model to anyone who's not American, and all of a sudden, this looks like an issue where our own sovereignty has to be defended by us, right? We can't sort of rely on others. That's the Americans. It's not even countries that that's our closest ally. So you go to more risky situations. And those kind of questions just become even bigger, right? You look at the critical minerals supply export licensing regime that China established last year. And in this case, they've established a situation where they can essentially throttle down or throttle up the supply of critical supplies, critical inputs to almost all global industry without even making an announcement about it. Right? All they have to do is sort of, not push the paperwork through on issuing a license as quickly as they might. Right? And the companies at the other end know what's going on, but there's no one making a decision that they can complain about. Right? It's a very powerful tool they've established, and it gives them complete visibility over almost the entire world's manufacturing supply chain and technologies. It's an incredible arrangement.
So would you say that China has fundamentally changed how Australia thinks about economic security?
You could probably say that. Sure. Not just China. I think the whole world has probably changed in a way that achieves that. I think probably China has been at the root of that by and large, because since they entered the WTO in 2001 or 2002, they've had an enormous impact on global economy, and to their credit, that since they joined the WTO, Chinese people have become incredibly wealthy compared to how they were before, and that's on a human issue, that's a fantastic thing. But at the same time, they're not really a market economy, right? Not really by any means, and yet they're in a system that assumes that everyone who's in this system is a market economy. Right? The rules are set up to assume that you're behaving in a particular way. They're not behaving that way at all, and they're not a small player, right? Where this player skirts around the rules, it doesn't really affect the system. No, they're a huge player, and when they're ignoring the rules entirely, it makes an incredible difference. So I think having a country that has a politically driven economy rather than a market economy in a market economy system, radically distorts the system, and it does force other countries to understand that the rules they think they're playing by are not the same rules that the rest of the economy is playing by.
But the Trump administration is also imposing a tariff on Australia. That's not what allies and friends do to each other, is it?
I agree entirely. It's not at all what allies and friends do. It's not what countries that follow the rule of law do. It's not what countries that follow economic rationality do. It's hugely self-destructive to America and to destructive to the rest of the global economy. Right? It's absurd and ridiculous, and there's nothing good to say about any of Trump's tariff regime. Or even some of his other recent sanctions regimes, put aside maybe Iran, but he seems to be wanting to use economic tools to coerce allies more than adversaries. He's got a very strange approach.
Um, what's your assessment of the Labour government's China strategy? It seems we can summarize Albanese government's strategy as stabilization. So, what's your assessment? Is that successful for the last 4 or 5 years, or
Mm,
no?
mm. Um, Stabilization to an extent has done, certainly had some successes. Um, I'm not sure if it's still the viable strategy. Um, we saw Albanese recently saying China does aim for hegemony, regional hegemony or global hegemony. That's not really the kind of comment I would have expected from him 2 years ago or even 1 year ago. Right? It's not really consistent with aiming for a stable relationship with China. To blatantly say, this is what they're aiming for. And in several other cases, right, his policies are directly and openly challenging China's strategic objectives, right, especially in the South Pacific, and creating alliances with several countries in the region. Quite clearly, that's about China. Quite clearly, that's about keeping China as a non-security partner in the region, right? Fine to have trade and investment, but let's not have police or military investment or dual-use wharfs or things like this. Um, that's a straight-up contest against China. It's not really the kind of thing that screams stabilization to me. So I think the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations actually has a different framing, and I suspect this maybe is a little bit better in that they say they describe it as risk informed engagement. Right? So the risk comes first, right? Rather than Albanese approach of where is it we engage where we can, or we cooperate where we can, we disagree where we must, and we something else. Where the cooperation is the sort of presumption. Risk-informed engagement, starts with the presumption of risk, and you work out what you can safely do together, but you don't presume that cooperation is the default.
Do you think Australia overestimating or underestimating China's long-term trajectory?
Mm, that's hard to know. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what Australia's assessment is. It's also hard to know exactly how China's going to fare. They've got a lot of headwinds, but they've come very far against expectations, I would say. So I wouldn't write them off. But you look at some of the population issues, you look at the debt, you look at the investment efficiency. They've got some huge challenges. On the other hand, you look at an area like AI, and China's building data centers because they just have too much energy supply. Right? They need something to soak up all the energy that they're producing. Uh, you know, this is one of their problems, right, with a non-market economy, is they're constantly oscillating between undersupply and oversupply. And when I was in China, I'm trying to remember precisely when, I think, let's say 15 years ago, almost every day there were brownouts in towns where I was, and on the weekends there'd be hours where there was no electricity to the whole town, and towns of about 1 million people, right? So 15, 20 years ago, they had a massive undersupply of electricity. Now they have this huge oversupply, right? Um, you know, that's one of the things that happens when you have sort of politically steered investment. And that's now causing them a lot of trouble with their relations with Europe, because they've got this huge oversupply of manufactured goods, especially vehicles. And Europe is noticing that it's completely undercutting European industry. Right?
Isn't having too much energy a very good problem to have? Compared to what we have in Australia, many consumers are complaining the
Yeah.
electricity price rising so much faster than everybody expects.
Yeah, for sure. It's certainly nice to have very cheap electricity, but if you're the person who invested in it, you're not getting your return, right? So um, you it means that you can have a lot of wasted investment, um, which could have gone to something else that's giving you more value. So if you're allocating your savings and your resources efficiently, you're not producing massive oversupplies of things, and you're not producing massive undersupplies of things, right? You're producing the amount you need. That's very difficult, right? No one does that perfectly. Um, and certainly having too much electricity is not the worst problem in the world, especially at a time when suddenly you're trying to electrify everything. You've got renewable energy transition to do. You've got AI to invest in. There's certainly plenty of things to soak that up. So it's not the worst outcome in the world for them. Um,
Well, many common commentators on the Australian left, and also I noticed that many in the Chinese Australian community, they are very fiercely opposed to the AUKUS deal, and they are very worried about the reliability of America as our security guarantor. And what they suggest is Australia should avoid choosing sides between China and the United States. Is that really realistic to not choose sides?
if we're talking about the choosing sides critique
Yeah,
specifically, then
yeah.
no, I think Australia is on a side. We have our values that are largely aligned with democracies, and largely unaligned with authoritarian regimes.
Yeah,
You know, if
but in the meantime, we're also China is also our largest trading partner, not the United States. So our economic well being is also heavily dependent on China, and
Mm.
that's many people would suggest we should at least maintain a healthy relationship with our biggest trading partners.
Yeah, look, you opened this in relation to AUKUS, and I would say we're sort of in the process of making a very long-term bet on the US when it comes to defense, and that's AUKUS, right? This is a sort of 40 or 80-year partnership that we're going down. With China, we're doing the similar kind of thing on green energy and green industry. We're looking at you might have heard this idea of Australia being a superpower in renewable or green metals or something. Right? This is the idea that um, if you can produce things like steel without using coal, right, the process that you do it by is you have a huge amount of industrial scale renewable energy, and then you can use something like hydrogen to as part of the um, production process rather than coal, right, in making steel. I can go into the details of that if you're interested, but
Yeah, please.
the short.
Actually, that's the also my
Okay,
question about the green
okay.
steel and green iron. Yeah.
Sure. So then the process here, normally the way you make steel is you dig up the iron ore, and iron ore is basically iron mixed with rock, right? And you know, a good iron ore deposit, high quality deposit might be 65% iron. An average one, Fortescue, I think, tend to have about 50% iron. Some of the others, in Australia, that's about where the range, right? 45 to 60, something like this. And then what you do, you crush it into smaller bits, and then you need to get rid of a lot of the rock and dirt, and just you want mostly iron, right? Um, and the way we do it at the moment is once we crush it into bits, we ship that off to China or Japan or Korea, Taiwan, whoever the customer is, and then they put in a blast furnace. And basically, the blast furnace is essentially melting off the rock. Right? You've got to heat it up to 1,200 degrees, 1,500 degrees. That uses a lot of coal, um, and you're melting the iron, melting the rock. And then once it becomes liquid, you can sort of separate it. Right, the rock sort of floats to the top like sludge, and the iron comes out the bottom, and you just skim it off, and then you get a sort of a more pure iron, and then you add in a little bit of carbon to make it steel. So that heating process is where most of the greenhouse gas emissions come from, right? And they produce making steel is about 10%, almost 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So we really want to do this, change the way this works, right? Australia is 2% of greenhouse gas emissions. If we can change the way steel is made, that's 5 times our emissions that we can affect, right? There's a huge advantage to us if we can do that. Stabilizing the climate is incredibly important, and there's a lot of money in it, right? Because everyone wants to do it. The people who can sell the products that will make it happen are the people who are going to make the money off it. So we would like that to be Australia, and we would like, iron ore is a industry that has huge margins as well, great for Australian exports. We would like that to keep, having sustainable customers. And so the way you can sort of do this is instead of shipping the iron ore to your customer where they use blast furnaces with coal, you can use a different type of furnace in Australia using hydrogen that you create from renewable electricity. So, to create hydrogen, you just run electricity through water, and that separates the H2O into oxygen and hydrogen. So you're making, if your electricity comes from renewables, then you've got completely renewable generated hydrogen, and you can use that. And there's a few other techniques that are kind of similar. You can use to do the reduction stage, right, to get rid of all the rocks and just get pure iron. And then you can ship the iron by itself, right, which is much higher value to ship, or you can use it here, right, if you create your own industry. And so the idea is that it should be cheaper to do that here rather than there, because all the renewable energy is here, right next to where the iron ore is being produced. Right, if you can do, so you cut out all the energy transmission effects. You cut out half the shipping costs, right? The economics of this maybe works out, right? For China to do it, most of their renewable energy resources are in Western China, whereas most of their industry is in Eastern China, right? So, you know, for them, they have huge losses in transmission if they try to do this kind of thing, the same kind of thing for themselves, right? So, how much they're happy to do it this way is unclear. How much it's all going to work out. There's a lot of open questions, I would say, but we're trying to do this. And to come back to your previous question about AUKUS, where it's a big long bet on America on security, this is the big long bet on China on the economy, right? So this is a sort of a 40 to 80 year investment project that we're looking at. Roughly the same time span as AUKUS, but it's on green industry, and it's not just China. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, others. But China is by far the biggest, and so if either relation goes badly, that would be an incredibly huge loss in terms of a bad investment decision.
Um, Now let's talk about China's industrial capacity, which is an area you studied. Many Western governments at the moment, especially the European governments, are complaining that China's manufacturing overcapacity is economically detrimental to the Europeans' own economy. Um, what's your assessment? Is the accusation have some merit, or are they, as many pro-Beijing commentators would say, this is reflecting the traditional Western bias against China?
Mm.
At the moment China developed has in that industrial capacity, the West will complain about overcapacity. It,
Mm. Look, I don't think there's no truth to that kind of a comment from China. There's a little bit of tendency to complain a bit too readily. I tend to not give too much credence to the idea, for instance, that China's currency is undervalued. I think the IMF is where countries register their monetary policy, and the deal is you can make up your own monetary policy, right? And in my view, um, you I don't see that much difference between setting an exchange rate and setting inflation target, right? Both of them, there's no reason to say that we couldn't increase our exchange rate by choosing a higher inflation target, right? And there's no reason to say that our inflation target is the correct one. It's just the one that we like. So, for me, some of that stuff is a little bit, but there's no true answer. And so why should we pick on the fact that they chose the answer that they chose? It's a little bit ungracious in my view. But, there are other aspects of it. And I've just come back recently from Europe, a week in Europe, to Brussels and Berlin, where they're really feeling pressure from China's industrial production. Right? And while I was there, Volkswagen announced, I think, 300,000 jobs laid off in a day, and their Germany is looking at 10,000 industry jobs every month being lost. Right? So they're really feeling a huge amount of pressure. Largely, when you go there and ask them about China, the first thing they say is China supports Russia, right? Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They're really cranky about that. But then they come to this oversupply of industry, and Europe is really looking at what they can do about it. They're looking at all sorts of trade measures, anti-dumping measures, anti-excess supply, I think they call it. Right? There's a whole sort of range of things. A lot of it boils down to tariffs, I think, which is not the best approach. I mean, I'm not 100% sure that it will work for them. If you put tariffs on Chinese cars, that might help you in your country, but it's not going to help you compete in the rest of the world. So they've got a big challenge. It's not the only. China's not the only source of this challenge, right? They've made some big calls badly, I would say. The European car industries didn't get on with electric vehicles when they all knew it was coming. Right? They left it wide open, and China walked in and took it. That's kind of a market outcome, to be honest. They should have been competing harder. and not just Europeans. The Japanese and Koreans did the same thing. Of course, we didn't because we don't even have a car industry. We got rid of that much earlier. Um, but then you look at some of the other challenges. Europe's energy supply is in a bad shape. Especially Germany. They originally had a big nuclear power section. They closed that after Fukushima. Then they made a bet on cheap Russian gas. That turned out to be something they didn't want to continue doing either, for very obvious reasons. Now they're back looking at coal and importing renewable energy components from China. And so, so that makes that whole series of bad bets has driven up their cost of their industry as well. So they've done a whole lot of things like this where they could have made their own better decisions. I think the situation now is, those of their own faults are what they have been focusing on. And now they've realized that China is also part of the situation. And so, it's the sort of new component, and that's why they're talking about it a lot more now. I don't think they think it's the only component.
Well, Germany and Japan and South Korea all experience their own export boom. What's the difference between their export boom and the Chinese export boom? Are we Can we also accuse Germany and Japan and Korea of dumping the product, or they're just simply being more productive and competitive? Can the same apply to China?
Yeah,
For example, their Chinese EVs are just probably more. Their production is more productive.
yeah, it's a great question, and in fact, people did blame Germany and Japan when they had their export boom. There used to be news magazines. We used to have magazines with made of paper, right? They used to be full of articles about how Japan was buying everything.
Yeah.
Right? Japan would own Manhattan, or Japan would own, all of Australia, or these kind of things. People would panic about it. Before Japan, it was Americans, right? In Australia, we used to say, "Oh my God, Americans are buying everything," and before that, it was the British. Right? Every time there's a sort of new wave of economic growth, people panic about who's getting control and this kind of thing, right? I think so on one hand, it is this sort of the same old story. There is a little bit of a different situation in this time for two reasons, probably. One is, China is enormous, right? Japan was never coming. What is Japan? 120 million people, maybe less now. China is 10 times bigger than that. So it's like 10 Japans at once. Okay, maybe not all of China is at the same level, but it's really a huge impact. The other one is that China's political system or political economy is quite different, right? And you have this situation where we're not competing against individual firms, because all those firms are part of a single network where they have to follow particular political guidance. They collaborate amongst. They have a sort of a sort of guanxi of firms, right? You buy into a sort of collaboration, a team of firms, and then they operate under ultimately a political direction rather than a individual market direction. So that creates quite a different dynamic, I would say, not just in terms of economic competitiveness, but in terms of how it affects your own political context, right? It means that when you're trading or investing with a Chinese organization, that gives the CCP leverage over you or over your government, right? And that kind of thing, I think, is relatively new. So those are two sort of differences, I would say.
Mm-hmm. So will the Chinese overcapacity in renewable energy and say EV accelerate global decarbonization? That's what we want? Is
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the US has got the wrong approach. They banned Chinese EVs. I think that's the wrong strategy. We need those, and we need those batteries. We need those solar panels as well. And to an extent, if China's going to subsidize them, then thank you very much. You know, but the other, so we certainly need to roll that out as fast as we can. The other side is this question of trust. What are they going to use this for later? There's a sort of a cybersecurity challenge with all of those things, right? EVs and batteries and others. Um, how do we have assurance that all these things that are data connected software driven services where they require frequent updates and almost constant connection to a server that's based in China? How do we know that those are going to work in our interests when we need them? Right? This is a pretty critical issue. I think for electric vehicles, it's also an incredible surveillance challenge. On the other hand, China, I think, is actually at the forefront of regulating this issue. Right? So I said the US is not doing a great job where they just ban it. I don't think that's a great answer. China's answer is, in fact, kind of perfect. They did actually ban Tesla for a couple of years while they got the rest of their regulations in place. But now they let Tesla in. They created regulations about where the data should be stored, that it should never leave China, right? About what about how you manage data of customers, how you manage data of miners, how you manage data of people that aren't the vehicle owner if they're in the vehicle, right? The audio data, the phone connections. If you drive near a military compound, the external facing cameras of the vehicle are not allowed to be working, or certain vehicles, Teslas are still not allowed to drive near military compounds. There's all these rules that they've put in place that are much better than just banning, right? And they've done it for their own needs. They're a good set of rules that would have worked for us. We should copy them on this one.
Um, so
And I'd say there's not much need to be more paranoid than the CCP when it comes to data security. So I think if it works for them, it's probably going to work for us.
Um, so, in terms of Australia's own industrial policy and strategy, so what do you suggest Australia can learn from the China's rapid industrialization, or anything we can learn, but without copying their political system?
Mm. So, I mean, one thing is agglomeration. China does these industrial parks so well, and they're not even parks anymore. They're like clusters of cities, right? The sort of industrial regions now. Um, and that creates economies for the industries that are just so efficient, right? If you can have your whole supply chain and your customers in the same area, and you can be talking with them constantly, it creates a hugely vibrant and competitive and innovative environment, right? That is something that certainly everyone has been trying to copy, I guess, for a while, right? We have a few things that are like that. Um, but trying to replicate that at our scale maybe is a challenge, but certainly it's something that we should keep trying at. I think another one is I mentioned before the oversupply of energy. At some point, you can just decide that we're going to cop the fact that we are going to pay a bit of inefficiency. We're going to accept a bit of inefficiency in order to get things moving. Right, and you do this in a range of areas anyway, right? When we have, if you pay for insurance, right, you're buying something, you're paying more than you need to, because something might go wrong, right? You're doing a less efficient thing because you don't know. You can do a similar kind of thing with energy supply. We can overinvest a bit, even if it means we don't get the best returns on energy, because it might mean that we can afford to create a whole lot of other things that we would otherwise not be able to unlock. I think we can do a little bit similar with finance, possibly. China has very low cost of capital at the moment. Partly that's because they have enormous savings and not many places to put it. Partly it's because when the political system says this is a priority investment, a lot of SOEs and banks and other things, will put money into that investment even if it's not giving them a return. So it's not so much that everyone gets a low cost of capital, but politically designated priorities certainly do, and that makes it very easy to greenlight projects, in those areas, which also contributes to this oversupply issue. Because it makes it very internationally competitive. If you can get incredibly cheap capital, and other companies can't, how are you doing that? Well, what they're actually doing, the analog of what they're doing for our system, is that they're taking a lot of the risk off the balance sheet of the private companies, and the government is holding the risk, right? And that's how they're getting the cost of capital down. Um, so that's one thing that we could be looking at here for something like green iron investments. You know, um, in order to make it easy so that Australian companies can make those investments. Because if it's not Australian companies or international companies making those investments, it's pretty much going to be Chinese SOEs, right, making these big green iron investments in the Pilbara. And ultimately, you get to a situation where if the investor is a Chinese SOE and the creditor is a Chinese SOE, and they're using Chinese technology and equipment to produce this stuff here in Australia, and the customers are all in China, like what part are we actually doing again? How is this really in our interests, other than stabilizing the climate? But it's not really in our direct commercial interest, right? We want to be part of it. So competing like that, I think is probably worth doing given the current state of the global economy.
Did Australia miss a golden opportunity in the area of renewable energy? Because at one time we were the leader in technology. Our university developed a lot of like solar technologies, and we were at the forefront. And one of the graduates from UNSW went back to China and built one of the biggest solar panel companies in the world. So, do you think Australia missed an opportunity at that time to develop our own industry, in renewable industry?
I don't think we could have done what China did. I think we did actually we got a pretty good outcome, I think, as far as we could get. And you're right, UNSW especially is, in fact, I think still is right at the forefront of the global renewable energy technologies, right? I think Australia is really right up there, um, developing that technology. And I think it's still largely sending the technology to China in order to commercialize and scale, because no one else is bringing the kind of capital investment to that industry that China does. And China had a particular reason other than, I mean, one, they wanted to, they saw an opportunity to, the energy was no longer going to be oil. They saw like Saudi Arabia and the US were sort of the oil barons of the last energy technology. They wanted to be the barons of the new energy technology, but they also understood that um, they were dependent on imported oil and gas, right? And this is where the whole South China Sea conflict sort of comes from originally, and where the Belt and Road issues come from, right? This is all about making sure that China can't be starved of energy, essentially, right? They want to make sure that they're in control of those passages, that they've got alternative routes. So they've put over the last 20 years a huge amount of investment into preventing, making themselves less vulnerable to an energy war or an economic war. And part of that is investing hugely in renewable energy. We would never have done the same thing. So, I don't think that just because we produce a lot of the technology, we could have imagined that we would be, manufacturing the world's solar panels. That would never have happened, I think. Um, mm.
Well, you mentioned just now about our relationship with China is moving on from engagement and stabilization to de-risking. So, what do you think is a successful engagement now look like?
Yeah, I think that certainly, I mean, on one hand, we have accepted, I think, and have to continue accepting, we're not going to change China. We should work with China as it is, and we should seek to understand it on its own terms. Um, and when I say China, I really mean the political system of China. Not everyone in China is maybe represented by that, but that's the institution that we have to engage. Um, and I don't think we can walk away. I don't think we can afford to do that for not just business reasons, but many reasons, and at the same time, human reasons, right? So many families and friends across both countries and around the region. You don't want tension if you can avoid it. Um, at the same time, you the CCP and China's political system has strategic objectives that are really incompatible with ours, and I think it should be one of our top priorities to make sure that that contest is continues to be fought in a way that is not catastrophic, for one thing. If China invaded Taiwan, I think that would be catastrophic, not just for Taiwan, and not just for China, but for the whole region and the whole world. So I think preventing that should be our top foreign policy priority. Um, but
Well,
beyond just Taiwan,
well, let's talk about that. Taiwan. How do you suggest? How can Australia help to prevent the possibility of a military action across the Taiwan
mm,
Strait?
look, in part, that's what AUKUS is about, although that's a full 40-year process, and we're really not talking on that timescale. I think that actually the more important thing that we can do is understand that um, this is not just a military campaign, right? This is a political and economic coercion campaign, right? And a social and cultural coercion campaign. And so what we really need to understand is how to do deterrence or fight back at the level where the fight is happening. Um, you know, Politicians ought to be able to get this because in large part it's a political campaign. And, for it's a message, trying to convince people of a particular narrative, right? This is what the CCP is doing, right? They're trying to convince people that Taiwan belongs to China, and anyone who tries to resist is stirring up trouble, right? And what we need people to understand is that, like anyone, the Taiwanese people have the right to self-determination, just like the Chinese people do, and just like the rest of Asia and all other countries do. And if anyone wants to rob them of that, that's the source of trouble, and that we, should defend people from having that stolen from them. Right? We should defend our neighbors from threats, not just Taiwan, but all of our neighbors. We should defend China if it's under attack for no good reason. And in fact, in the past, we have. So on this sense, much of the conflict is not military; it's political, and we need to remember to be in that contest. Right? It You still have to invest in the military side of things because if one side is losing the political battle and they've got an overwhelming dominance militarily, they're very clearly going to be tempted to shift the ground from politics to military because that's where they think they can win. So we don't want them. We don't want the CCP to decide, actually military is going to be easier. Um, but we certainly don't want to cede the ground on every other front either. So I think we have to understand China much better uh, on its own terms, its own political system, and understand what it's trying to achieve, its strategic goals, understand where, what our strategic goals are, understand our own values better, and therefore understand how to defend them when that's necessary.
Um, Last topic. You are very much involved in labor politics here. Can you give an assessment about the political communication strategy or the failure or the success of Labour's recent, say, the tax reform? It seems to me they have lost the public relation war, at least well, I guess unsurprisingly in the conservative media at least, but that's not unsurprising. So do you think Labour has succeeded in its messaging war over the tax plans?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. The budget. So initially, when the budget came out, I think it got quite good response from a lot of experts, and people were really excited about it. I think what happened that maybe people didn't catch, people on our side didn't catch, is this. We'd spent so much time talking about a particular subset of the problem in terms of capital gains for housing. And no one had really talked about this idea of changing the rules for all capital gains, right? Certainly, I'd never heard that until it got released in the budget. Um, and I didn't really know how to respond to that. I was quite happy about the changes to housing capital gains, but others, well, hadn't really thought about it because no one had talked about it, right? It wasn't on the agenda, and then all of a sudden it's there. And my understanding is that that came really out of Treasury because they thought, it's economically worse to just create more distortions, right? You want to treat things equally and remove distortions, and that makes sense. But politically, you want to let people know what you're doing before you suddenly surprise them with a big tax change, because that changes their personal budget. It changes all of their decisions. It changes the value of their assets and their opportunities in life. You don't want to sort of you know shock people with that kind of thing. And I think that you know maybe I honestly don't know why they didn't manage to catch that earlier and decide, realize what they were, how to do this more sensibly. You know, it's a very sort of process-driven government, I would say, and it's the kind of thing I would have expected them to be on the ball with. I think they changed the details fairly late in the game and didn't have time to sort of, discuss it with the public properly and, cop the consequences.
Was it a broken election promise?
Sort of. Well, on one hand, obviously, but on the other hand, the most fundamental promise you make at an election is to use your own judgment. Right? Who you are is the main thing that you present to the electorate. Right? This is why I would say changing leaders is probably a bigger election promise. Right? Because who is your team? That's a pretty fundamental part of your campaign. But using your own judgment is probably the thing that people can judge you on the most, because you don't know no one goes through the whole policy book and says, I like this, and I don't like that. And I give each one some kind of weighted score and judge them against the other parties. No one does that. They look at the players, they say, I like this guy more than that guy, or this woman more than that woman, and that's who I'm going to vote for. And it's because you trust them to make good decisions. So, whether you said before the election that this was a decision you were planning to make, after the election, the circumstances are what they are, and you still use your best judgment. So, yes, they said they wouldn't do this. I think they should never have said that. I think these rule in, rule out games are just designed to create problems, and you should avoid them at all costs. But they said it. They said it many times, in fact. Um, at the same time, there's clearly a problem that had to be dealt with, and they dealt with it in a pretty, sensible way. So, they broke some promises, but they kept other promises. I guess they set themselves up so that they had no way out without breaking some kind of promise. Um,
Mm, with with the One Nation's rise in the polls, I I think mostly they gain from the coalition voters, but they might have stolen a small percentage of middle or left wing populist voters. How do you suggest Labour to counter the rise of this populist right
yeah,
movement?
yeah, it's not that small a percentage either. I think maybe 10%. Um, Yeah, to me, I think there's a couple of things going on here. One is people feel maybe unheard, right, and out of control. Right, this is to me probably the two biggest things. And this idea that people aren't being heard, since social media, we're all talking so much more, and everyone's projecting, but no one, with all these voices, no one's sort of hearing more than they used to hear. So, everyone's sort of screaming into the void, and it drives us all crazy, I think. And it seems like, you know, you've got all these things to say, but you don't have any access to the processes for it to be meaningful. So I think what we really need to do there is invest much more in our democratic processes, right, to make it so that people can be heard in a meaningful way, so that people can engage in a meaningful way, right? Um, for instance, you mentioned I get involved in Labour Party politics. To me, it's less of a team-based sport and more of a pick which pond you're going to swim in and fight in, right? So within Labour, I have plenty of arguments on policy issues against other Labour people, in a way that I don't have with people from other political parties, because I'm just in this sort of particular pond. And that makes it more viable that you can actually engage in a meaningful way, right? When you're dealing with fewer people. So, getting involved in that kind of way, I think is one thing that's really useful. And inviting people to get involved in that kind of way, right? We never recruit. We never open the door. We never say this is how you do it, right? We never. It always seems to be that once people work out how the system works, they keep it to themselves. They don't want anyone else to learn because that's their sort of moat, right? Their opportunity to excel. Actually, I think we should be doing the opposite. We should be helping everyone participate as much as possible to understand how things work. And then we should also be investing in all the sort of democratic integrity things, getting money out of politics, right? Making sure that corruption is properly policed, making sure that we don't have foreign interference and all these kind of things, right? That the education is properly available to everyone. Um, you know, this I think is really probably at the heart of what we can do to reverse this. Rebuild people's trust and understanding and faith in the system.
So, what is there a version of the populist left pool of ideas to counter the populist right on
There probably is.
affordability, on
Oh yeah,
anti-corruption, on what
yeah.
many of the core messages from Pauline Hanson that Labour
Mm.
can tackle?
Look, I think it's not so much a populist left that we need. I think that it'd almost just be the same, but the same, mirror. I think what we need is to make sure that things work, right? That get the basics right. We need to make sure that housing supply is available. We need to make sure that hospitals work and you can bulk bill. We need to make sure that people have access to education and childcare, and that you don't have to do some ridiculous stunt in order to get your kid looked after. Right?
Actually, let me interrupt here. Let's talk about one of the core complaint or idea from Pauline Hanson is about immigration. Is that she's and also some in the coalition are suggesting immigration is one of the key contributor to housing shortages. Do you think
Yeah,
that has a merit, the argument?
not really. Um, I
But
think she's been
immigration
arguing.
does increase demand, right? So that's
Yeah,
affect the
but
balance of
so
the market.
so two things there. I think on one hand, she's been arguing against immigration for decades. And I think the housing market is just the latest rationalization. But it's like an excuse for her to be against immigration. She's always been against immigration. It's never had anything to do with the housing market until this year. Right? So I don't believe her that it's about housing. But that's not true necessarily for all of the One Nation supporters, right? Because she never had 30% support before. So a lot of them weren't buying the message when it was just about immigration, and now they're buying it. So for voters, maybe they're accepting this argument. Um, yeah, I mean, having more people means that you need more houses in order to keep the price stable. Sure. Um, but I think we don't have a ridiculously high immigration rate. COVID messed around with it a bit. We had a couple of years where it was ridiculously high after a couple of years where it was zero. Um, I think we can handle, a bit less than 1% population growth every year. Uh, you if we're 27 million people, that'd be 270,000 new people coming a year. I think we can handle that. That's not a radical transformation of the country. I think it would be good if we had uh, people coming from all around the world. At the moment we have a situation where a lot of the main path to citizenship is through university degrees, right? Through becoming an international student is sort of the easiest way to get in. And so then you look at, well, who's becoming an international student, and
Chinese and
typically,
Indians. Yeah.
mainly, and there's an obvious economic reason for that, right? These are the countries where they have enough people with the wealth required to pay Australian international student fees, but they don't have you know ready, like, easy access to world-class universities at home. They have some world-class universities at home, but not everyone in China or India can access them. It can be much easier for a lot of people to get that here. Um, so you compare that to like Germany, for instance, where they have world-class education for free at home, why are they coming all the way to Australia to pay $50,000 or $70,000 a year for the same quality? Right? Not many of them are going to do that. So we can. I would like to see a sort of HEX arrangement available to international students from countries that can manage that. Meaning, if they go back to their own country after they've been a student, they can pay off their student fees through their tax system. Just to make sure that we can have a much more diverse global market of students, and then we have a sort of a maybe less pressure on um, less pressure on our culture to change in a particular direction. If the pressure is coming from all directions equally, right, then the core can sort of hold a little bit better maybe. um, I think that maybe dilutes some of the concern that people have. But ultimately, for me, immigration is not something that I particularly panic about. I think we've done great for immigration. Uh, you know, but for sure, there's people that have different views on it.
Well, thanks very much for the contribution, and we'll keep in touch, and we'll certainly will have more things to discuss in the future.
Sure, thanks a lot, Hang Yang. It's great speaking with you, and yeah, we'll certainly enjoy to keep in touch.
Thank you.